it's called the first concept album. It doesn't go anywhere. Mr. Kite, all my contributions have absolutely nothing to do with this idea of Sergeant Pepper and his band. But it works, because we said it worked, and that's how it appeared.
Yeah.
But it was not as put together as Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have a concept. It starts out with Sergeant Pepper and introduces Billy Shears, and that's the end, apart from the so-called reprise.
Right.
Otherwise, every other song could have been on any other album.
Right. It's the reprise. That
Right.
does it.
Mr. Kite could have gone anywhere. Lucy could have gone anywhere. A Day in the Life could have gone anywhere. So it's not really, there's no concept there.
In fact, during the making of Sgt. Pepper, George hadn't showed for most of the album, which was unusual, because we normally showed for our recording sessions. George hasn't been too interested in making that album. I think he was building a swimming pool. And it was just all a little bit like that. And of course I was sort of thinking, well, I won't say anything, but it's a bit dodgy.
Well, Sgt. Pepper for me was great because it's a fine album. It's a fine album, but I did learn to play chess on it because I'd have so much spare time, We'd do the basic track and then we'd put other stuff on and then the percussion would be overdubbed later and later,
For me, it was kind of a bit tiring, or it was a bit boring because, I had a few moments in there that I enjoyed, but generally I didn't really like that album much. My heart was still in India, that was the big thing for me when it happened in the '66. It was after that, everything else seemed like hard work, it was a job. It was like doing something I didn't really want to do. I was losing interest in being fab at that point.
Wasn't that spectacular? When you look back on it, like anything, it was great then. But people just have this dream about Pepper. It was good for then,
It's weird that Sgt. Pepper, arguably the most acclaimed Beatles record, isn't really one of their favorites, except for Paul. Today, we're finding out why. By November 1966, when the Beatles began laying down tracks for the album that became Sgt. Pepper, Paul had become the band's de facto artistic director. Pepper was Paul's baby. He conceived the idea, wrote at least half the songs, ran the recording sessions, supervised the mixing, and arranged for the precedent-making package. When Paul felt like it, John claimed, he would come in with about 20 good songs and say, "We're recording," and I suddenly had to write a f***ing stack of songs. Pepper was like that. Even if John's account was true, it would hardly be a crushing indictment of Paul. It simply confirms the suspicion that Paul's power was founded primarily in John's growing apathy, which had produced an aversion to work and responsibility. Suppose Paul hadn't come with his 20 good songs, what would have happened to the Beatles? The answer is that they would not have produced the album that brought them their greatest acclaim. Nor would John have been inspired to compose some of his most memorable tracks. Clearly, Paul was simply stepping into the breach created by John's delinquency in order to hold the band together and keep it moving. John was not the only Beatle to experience depression during these sessions that produced Sgt. Pepper. All the boys but Paul were numbed by this unprecedented ordeal. 700 hours of studio time were logged from November 1966 to March 1967, every minute of it devoted to the Beatles' next annual spring LP. The basic problem was not the direction in which Paul was leading the band, but the simple fact that the Beatles had set out to make an album that would extend the frontiers of pop recording without first gaining access to a studio that represented the current state of the art. Studio 2 at Abbey Road didn't bear the remotest resemblance to a modern recording facility. Constructed in 1931 to make classical records for HMV, it looked like an austere white art cinema whose seats had been removed and whose projection booth had been shoved to one side, where it was reached by climbing a long double flight of stairs. Inconvenient and uncongenial, it was also hopelessly out of date from a technical standpoint. The control board was so crude that just to do a routine playback, the engineers had to repatch the leads, a process that might consume a half hour. The tape recorders were obsolete 4-track machines. Nor were there any electronic refinements. For example, when the Beatles wanted that funny speaking tube effect they exploited on Yellow Submarine, instead of the engineer throwing a switch to activate a filter, he would give John a cardboard mailing tube down which he had to holler. At such moments, the Beatles were just like radio performance back in the studios of the 30s, which in fact is where they were. The solution to all these problems was simple. In fact, it had long since been adopted by the Rolling Stones. The Beatles could have boarded a plane for New York, or better, Los Angeles, and enjoyed the finest recording equipment in the world. The boys were ambitious, hard-working, highly creative young men, but they were markedly deficient, both in practical resourcefulness and in the sort of self-confidence that enables man to make demands and insist upon their fulfillment. They made the best of what they were given, even when it made them miserable. To picture the Beatles during the creation of what is universally regarded as the ultimate masterpiece of the rock age, you must imagine them sitting about in odd corners of a vast and dreary space. Most of the time, they were idle, whiling away the hours in pastimes like playing chess or cards, drinking tea or eating beans on toast while chatting with their childhood friends or cronies from Liverpool. Paul, meantime, was frantically busy running up the long staircase to the control booth for a quick conference with George Martin, then dashing down the stairs again to try something out on mic, then summoning the boys to do their parts until it was time to hear what they had recorded, which meant another long layout. When the waiting had reached unbearable heights, John would suddenly snap out of his trance and thunder up at the control booth. "What the f*** are you doing up there? You're not supposed to be taking tea breaks. You're supposed to work straight through because we're the f***ing Beatles." To get themselves through the endless nights, the Beatles had to take something for their heads. It is ironic that the most celebrated work of acid rock should have been created under the influence of a chemical cocktail that dates back to the period when Abbey Road was built. Barry Miles discovered the secret of the Beatles' patience one night when he noticed that all the boys were provided with stopper test tubes filled with a white powder. When he was offered the hit, he inquired cautiously, "What is it?" He was surprised by the answer, "A speedball." Instead of already bringing songs to the studio, they came to work now like jazz musicians with just a germ of an idea, a title phrase, a hook, a few scrawled stanzas on a piece of paper. Through collective improvisation, they created their songs before the mics, aided by the steadily increasing contributions of George Martin, who functioned not just as a producer but as a composer, arranger, sound effects man, recording engineer, and instrumentalist. This collaborative process had its good and bad sides. The great advantage was that by composing directly on tape, they cut out the intermediate stage between the concept and the final product. The disadvantage, apart from time-wasting inefficiency, was that the 5 collaborators were not of one mind. Paul came closest to getting what he wanted because he would make the band go through countless takes of his tunes until he achieved perfection. Then he would stand over the engineers, monitoring every moment of the crucial mixing process. John could not tolerate repetition or tedium. He liked to cut records 1, 2, 3. He was punished for his lack of persistence by seeing some of his best work mutilated. Here too, he laid the blame squarely on Paul, asserting, Paul would subconsciously try and destroy a great song. The song whose destruction John most resisted was Strawberry Fields Forever. The Pepper myth is bigger, but the music on the White Album is far superior. John once said in 1971, George and Ringo also didn't think Pepper was the peak of the Beatles. In fact, both spoke of being bored during the making of the record. For me personally, it is a landmark album. However, it's not my favorite because we were using each other in a way and being used, where you'd be the drummer on record and then you'd have all the strings. It felt like we were doing sessions. Nothing could have been more characteristic of Paul McCartney than the idea of Sgt. Pepper, because even though he was the Beatles' avant-gardist, at heart Paul was an old-fashioned entertainer, a nostalgist who delighted in recalling the world of his boyhood. He was at his best, composing musical genre paintings that captured some treasured feature of common English life. Hence, the paradox of Sgt. Pepper, which was offered and received as the voice of the brave new world of the 60s, but which, when examined years later, appears to lie squarely in the mainstream of popular music, reaching back at least as far as Gilbert and Sullivan. Sgt. Pepper was released into a cultural climate hot and fecund with fantastical ideas and beliefs. The hippies, inspired by the yearning to recover the imaginative core of life, sat pondering the album's mystifying cover through the smoke of joss sticks and tie sticks, like monks poring over an allegorical illumination. Triumphantly, the pop pundits proclaimed the old Beatles dead and buried, the new Beatles reborn and risen. Pepper was sacred music, a hippie resurrection. What a pity that the release date was not Easter.